Hello, everybody. Welcome to this biweekly information session. It's Marcus with Exponential Destiny, and I've got the leadership team, a good portion of leadership team here with Samantha, Zach, Pablo, and Abby. And we're excited this week to share with you a topic that I think will be of significant interest for many of you, because it's intended to help you jumpstart your thinking around your creative environment for the Metaverse for SDGs Global Prize in VR competition. And what we've identified after talking to many of you out there in the community who are competing on this competition, by the way, there's over 800 of you that have registered now across 65 countries. And every week we talk to many individuals that are participating, and we're really excited to hear some of your ideas and what you're coming up with and the sustainable development goal that you've selected as a team and what your approach is. And we know there's kind of two camps of individuals in terms of using this technology to bring to life the sustainable development goals. Some of you as a team are diving right into virtual reality or on the desktop, but you're getting into the platforms. So whether you chose, Engage VR as your platform or Spatial or Horizons, whatever platform you decided to create in to bring your SDG to life, some of you are really comfortable just getting into the platform. Again, you could use your desktop or get into the headset. If you don't have headsets yet, you could do it entirely on a desktop. But you're building your 3D immersive and experiential environments to build education awareness and empathy around your sustainable development goal. And getting into the platform itself is your creative process. You do it very organically. You're getting in there and you're pulling in objects and you're brainstorming and you're doing it in real time. And you and your team are coming up with the concepts and ideas, and you're exploring that and you're evolving it from there. So some of you feel very comfortable doing that, and that's one approach. There was an information session that we did. It was number 3. So if you go to the YouTube channel, you'll see information session number 3. That was with Chris Madsen of Engage, where we actually shared some of that approach and methodology of just getting in there and start creating and how you can do that pretty organically. However, for some of you, I know we've seen some of you that are getting a little bit almost like writer's block, where you get into these environments and you're trying to think about how to create something, but you're getting kind of these challenges with furthering your thinking and coming up with your concepts and ideas. And so we wanted to share with all of you an approach that we've been using on a project with a commercial client that we think could be adapted very well to the Metaverse for SDG Global Prize in VR competition that you're all working on. And the reason we like this approach is we think that everyone can do this approach because it's about telling stories. So let me just give a little bit of context here. We have a commercial client, as a nonprofit, we do work with schools and nonprofit organizations, but we have a group from Exponential Destiny that also does some commercial projects for businesses that want to use this technology. And we have a commercial client that essentially he's a financial advisor, and he wrote a screenplay. He wrote like a theater play. Essentially, he wrote a story. And he basically sat down and literally wrote out, I don't know if he used Microsoft Word or did it on pen and paper, but he basically wrote out a story. And, he infused some comedic relief and some humor, and he tried to make it fun and entertaining, but he basically wrote out a story about how he's going to share information about the financial services work that he does. And we've been working with him for the last several months on taking basically a written story that he narrates and he reads, and literally bringing in the audio file of him talking about, delivering this narrative, this story, and bringing it into a platform, a virtual reality platform, but then mapping visuals to the story after the fact and trying to bring aspects of his story to life using the superpowers we have in virtual reality. And we found out and discovered a few really interesting things. First of all, writing a story and telling a good story is a skill set that most people have, or as a team, someone on your team has. And it's a little easier to evolve that concept by writing it out as a story with a beginning and end, a climax, a whole narrative, right? And if you can write a story and the story just being read is interesting, imagine what you can bring it from good to great when you actually start to bring visuals and VR into the picture. So again, rather than going into VR and working with objects and all the visuals and then trying to put a story around it, this is the opposite approach. This is the approach of, well, put the VR stuff aside for a second and just write a good story. And one way of doing this is not better or more effective than another way of doing it. They're just different. It just depends on you and your skill set and how you approach things. So we thought it'd be helpful to share with you this other approach in this methodology of telling a story. Now, in your case, for this purpose, you'd be telling a story around the Sustainable Development Goal that you've selected with your team, and make the story interesting and compelling and educational, make it entertaining, etc. And then once you feel like you and your team have a good story that's written out and you test it among each other, maybe you test it with some friends and family, then you know you're headed in a good place, because that story is just going to get better when you bring virtual reality into it, right? So this is an approach and methodology that we're going to share with you. And between Pablo, Sam, Zach, and Abby, we'll give you some, we'll share our screen and give you some visuals so you can kind of really see what we're talking about. We've actually even built some tools to help with the method, spreadsheets and ways to track things in order to bring objects to the story and kind of map it. So we're going to describe that to all of you in this session. And that's really what we're emphasizing here is, your goal is education, awareness, and empathy around an SDG. So pick an SDG, tell a story. I'll give you one example, like just to get your thinking out there, right? Let's say your SDG is life below water. So you're dealing with oceans and life below water and marine life, etc. Maybe, not to sound hokey, but maybe your story is about Danny the dolphin, and you do it from a first person perspective, and you're Danny the dolphin, and Danny the dolphin has this beautiful place and ocean that he used to swim in when he was younger. And fast forward to today, there's a lot more bottles in the water where Danny is trying to swim, and the ocean's more polluted, and the coral's not as beautiful, and the colors are kind of bleached, etc. And so that's the premise for a story, and you can tell it from the lens of Danny the dolphin, and Danny will take you on a tour and take you through his childhood and remember playing in these beautiful oceans and this beautiful water, and then describe how over time Danny started to see things change and his family started to notice it, and some of his friends and family got unhealthy because the water was polluted. Whatever your imagination comes up, but that's what we're talking about. Make it interesting. And if you can write that out as a story, like a script, and you can have different actors and different roles, and maybe it's just not Danny telling the story, maybe Danny's cousin or brother or sister's in the story, or Timmy the tortoise or whatever, right? Just come up with something interesting and fun and have fun with it. And if you can do that, you really have the ability to then test that. Again, take some friends and family and read them the story, or have them read the story. And if you find people engaged and interested and kind of wanting to listen to the story and being motivated by the story, then right there and then that you've got something that's an asset that you can cultivate into something really compelling once you bring it into virtual reality. Because then when you bring in a virtual reality, you're just going to add all the bells and whistles and the special effects and bring this story to life in really unique ways, right? So with that said, Sam, maybe you want to pull up our methodology. Actually, I can share my screen with the methodology, which gives a little bit of a visual of the approach. And Sam, maybe you can talk to these steps. I'll put the first three up there first, and then I'll just add some color commentary, but maybe you can hit these just to put this in perspective for people.
Yes, so we actually discussed the first three steps in information session number 2 more in detail, but just to go over it, we've kind of edited a little just to design your metaverse for SDGs experience rather than just the VR experience in general. But just going over the first three, step 1 is just research the SDG. So this is online. You can talk to experts, go to a library, go to a center that specializes in SDGs. But the easiest way clearly is just to simply Google your SDG, just literally put SDG number 2 and you'll get millions of resources on that SDG specifically. But you could also go to the United Nations website because they have all the information on SDGs as well. And you can even go into the specific ones and they have the resources for links and other things, but they also have what they're doing and what they have done for that SDG already on the website. And so then going to step 2, that's tell a story, design a narrative. That's kind of what Marcus explained a little with Danny the Dolphin right there. So just start thinking of a way to make this SDG or what you want to bring across for the SDG in a story mode. So try to think of how you can make it flow, because you're not just going to throw a bunch of information at people. That'll be a little too overwhelming for them. So you kind of want to think of how you can navigate a story and how you can put this SDG into that story. And so then step number 3 is going to be incorporate edutainment strategies. So again, another concept we spoke about was that wow factor versus education factor. It's a 2x2. So that's where you think of your story and think of if you have enough education factor in it, which is, do you have enough statistics? Do you have enough research for it? And then that wow factor, do you have something that'll keep the audience entertained and wanting to learn more? Or will it kind of just be a bunch of information coming at you? So you kind of want to have a good balance of those two in your story.
Yeah, maybe just pausing there for a second, Sam, like, so this is important because when you tell your story, you've got to think to yourself, if I'm going to create a VR experience eventually around the story, well, that's going to help a lot. That's going to make it really interesting and engaging and, you know, with all the special effects, et cetera, right? You also should think about, you know, how can you maybe make the story funny or humorous? That's one of these wow factor elements. You know, everyone likes humor, everyone likes comedy. So if that's your thing, incorporate comedy into it. You can also introduce the notion of gamification or game theory, which is this concept of how can I make this so the participants who are going through this story in virtual reality in my final creation are actually participating. So they're not just passive observers. They actually get engaged and they participate, and maybe, you know, and it's fun because they're participating. It's something that can really make it interesting. And if you can gamify education, you're really onto something, because that's kind of the golden ticket to really make education easy when people feel like they're participating. Now, let's pause here because I want to give an example of what we mean by gamification, because there's a whole bunch of cool things you can do. And Pablo here from our team, who's on the leadership team, he worked on something that we did for a school in Los Angeles this last summer as one of the projects we do to help schools transform how they do education. And he put an element of gamification that I think would be worth sharing. And specifically, he took a popular game it's a game from a television show in the United States. It's called Jeopardy. Some of you maybe have seen this, even if you're not in the United States. But well, I don't want to steal Pablo's thunder. Let me turn it over to Pablo. But what we're trying to do is to show you how in virtual reality, as part of this story and part of an environment, there's one section of this story where we wanted to test students' knowledge of what the story delivered. So the story ends with them going to this one section where they get to play this game, like being on a game show in virtual reality. So Pablo, let me turn it over to you, and maybe you can share your screen and share that.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. So essentially, the space that we created was the idea was, how do we take the concept of grants and scholarships, right? So when applying to college, right, it costs money, and the government many times, or corporations, give out, you know, kind of open contests to whoever can, you know, answer a question, or kind of like, you know, answer a question or fulfill a prompt. And if you fulfill it, if you write the question and answer it in the way that you're looking for, you have a chance of winning free money. So with my students and my team, we kind of thought ideas, how can we, you know, bring this idea into VR? How can we make it gamified? How can we make it, you know, exciting? And we found out that, you know, the idea of having a prompt, answering the prompt, and having that evaluated kind of falls in line with the game of Jeopardy, right? Where you're on a stage, people are asking you questions, and depending on your answer, you know, you have a chance of winning free money. So I'm going to share my screen here and show the room that my students and I created, which is make them pay, right? Because at the end of the day, this room is designed to test knowledge about college resources. So let me zoom in a little bit. So this room has a few key features, right? When you first join
Pablo,
the room.
did you optimize your sound and picture?
Yes, I did.
Okay, it's a little blurry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So when you first enter the room, right, like it's pretty obvious what the theme of the room is, right? It's obviously a game show, right? It's meant to be kind of fun and exciting, and there's a few elements in there that kind of reinforce that, right? Over here on one of the I think I'm gonna say projectors, or like the Megatrons, or the, I don't know exactly what it's called, but we actually created a game show concept for it, right? A bit of ambiance to it, as well as some interactive features like a timer and some responses. So when students are over here on the main stage, right? So the entire premise is you pick a category that could be vocabulary, FAFSA, or PAQ, and then you pick the level of hardness you want a question to be. Each level of hardness has a different kind of payout. It could be $200, $400, or $600. So we have podium stages. We have a podium here, so 3 students can play at a time, and it could be 1 judge. So a student will come over here and say, for example, I want to pick vocabulary or FAFSA for 200. Okay, so FAFSA. The question is the FAFSA application free? Obviously, we go over here, give the student 10 seconds to answer the question. Right? Kind of goes into the aesthetic of a game show, right, where it's counting down, the classic game show music and appears. And then once that time is up, we go into the next slide, and that's the answer. It's gonna be yes. So if the student got it right, then the student then comes over here to the power cash, and then that pile now is theirs, right? That's $200 cash that they in virtual reality can then hold. And the thing is, as you're playing the game, you can see your cash accumulate, right? And so that kind of adds on to the the idea of I'm winning, right? I have some tangible items that I'm seeing, grow in front of me, that I'm progressing in the game. And there's replay value in the fact that questions can be answered in multiple different ways, and depending on the judge, you could either get the cash prize or not. So there's a variety of different answers and ways that they can answer in the PAQ and the vocabulary, because it's all based on interpretation and lived experiences.
And so what you see here, maybe you can zoom out a little bit, Pablo. So what you can see here is, imagine bringing in a bunch of students or learners. Now, in your guys' case, this would be a game show, maybe testing the knowledge around the sustainable development goal that you chose, that you just took people through a whole environment to educate them, right? So this is where you can help, where they can go to finish up the experience by testing their knowledge. And so when we've done this, what Pablo's sharing with you here, when we've done this and you have all these students in the room, it's literally all these students and you're playing a whole game show. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about adding a wow factor or education factor, a wow factor to your experience, and including game theory or gamification. Now, pick a game that is culturally relevant to you. Here in the United States, we could take Monopoly, you could take tic-tac-toe, you could take any game you want and repurpose it and customize it specifically for this experience, right? And that's what we mean by adding this wow factor to the education factor. So hopefully you were able to get a good understanding for what we mean by, game theory or gamification, and making the audience participate in the actual exercise. So thanks for that, Pablo. So those are the first 3 steps. And then the step 4, 5, and 6, essentially you're going to think through, when you write your story, you've got to, and you start to design an experience, you have to think through, well, who is your audience? With the SDG Metaverse Prize, you should think like, am I designing this for, a demographic of middle school students to teach middle school students? Am I doing this for a demographic of high school students? Am I doing this for adults, into their 20s and 30s? And, what is the purpose and who are the personas? You don't really want to create an environment that you feel is going to be effective for every type of demographic. It's okay for you to tell us, when we're evaluating your space, who the intended audience is, the demographic for the audience. That's what step 4 is. And step 5 is then taking the story that you've created and some of the concepts around gamification and other wow factor elements, and starting to map it to the visuals within VR to that narrative. And let's get kind of tactical here, okay? What we've done as a method to implement this process is we took that step 2 of the story. Once the story was written, we literally had the narrative read by the author of the story. Now, in your guys' case, it's someone on your team who's got a good narrative voice will actually read the story with all the voice inflections to make it exciting, etc., right? And then you take the audio file of your story and you divide it into timestamps. And the entire audio file, essentially the entire narrative, the entire story, you're going to dissect it into different timestamps. So minute marker 1 minute and 23 seconds to minute marker 1 minute and 48 seconds. Here's what we discussed in the story. Now let's think about some visuals that we'll eventually put into VR as we start to think about and map out how we're going to bring that story to life. And that process of taking the whole story, putting it into bite-sized chunks, and then thinking through each of those bite-sized chunks to think about what ways you can bring that story to life is a really good approach versus just going into VR with the audio of the story and trying to take the whole thing at once and produce something around it, right? You almost have to create these manageable pieces that you essentially design for the actual production you're going to produce in VR. And for that, Zach will actually share with you some of the tools that we've used, as well as some examples of the actual work that we've done for a client where we brought that client's narrative, the audio, into a software, in this case, Engage, and brought it to life. So with Zach, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Marcus. So what we've found to be probably the most useful tool is PowerPoint. And so we will do what Marcus said. We'll have an audio clip of our narrative, and then we'll kind of pick out timestamps in that audio clip, and we'll decide on an action that we want to happen in VR. So this example here, we have our timestamp at 9:50, and at the moment we put down the quote of what's being said, and the narrative is talking about a business tycoon who's got to settle for a Bentley instead of a Rolls, which are 2 different cars, both high end. And so we decided, all right, let's have both cars roll up, and that will be the action. And so we do that for all the major timestamps that we have. And then we go and we find, all right, well, now we need to find a Bentley and a Rolls. And we can either find maybe a 3D object, a picture, whatever we find, just to put it in there and get an idea of how it looks. And we do that with everything. And we just go through and collect all these different pictures, 3D objects, based on our slides that we build, that we have everything written out with the time, the action, and the quotes. Then when we actually go in and build it, which I can show off, we sometimes decide if there's things that need to be added or taken out. So I can share now a few clips of some of the stuff.
Just to pause real quick, Zach. So what you're looking at there on the slide, this is, again, this is taking the entire story, this narrative that was written, and putting it into different chapters and different scenes, so dividing it up. And then within those chapters and scenes of that story, literally getting down to a specific timestamp of when in the audio, when the narrator says something very specific that we think, once listening to the whole story, well, that's an area that we can add some visual in VR. And so what Zach is doing here is he's showing you one slide of many out of a full PowerPoint deck where we've dissected the entire narrative, the entire story that was narrated, and found those gold nuggets of opportunity to where we could actually put some wow factor to bring to life the story once we brought it into VR. So we're not in virtual reality yet. We're just brainstorming and ideating using PowerPoint as a way to capture those thoughts. And that's a great exercise for you and your team to do. Maybe one person on your team is really good at telling stories. Another person on your team is really good at narrating the story and actually, vocally, narrating the story. And maybe someone else on your team is really good at, okay, what are the visuals and the creative concepts we can bring in to bring those quotes to life? And then I think, Zach, you're going to show what it looks like once you actually get it into VR.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed out the chapters and the scenes. I forgot to mention that this entire narrative that I'm showing an example of was actually a 2-hour narrative. And so it was really important for us to break it into chapters that were between 10 and 20 minutes. And with each chapter, we would have a different environment. And so maybe you have someone on your team who's good at just looking at the whatever software you're working on and seeing what environments are available for us to build our narrative in. Or maybe they're also really good at going out and finding those objects that you want to add for the actions. Because we have broken our team up in that way where some of us work on the slides, some of us work on the editing, some of us work on finding the assets. So breaking up that into buckets of work can really speed up the process and also make sure the best people for the job are working on it. But let me show off a few examples of where we took the slides and we put it right into VR.
By the way, I think for the SDG Metaverse Prize, there's no limit on the story, but we anticipate most of you, will probably be doing stories. We'll be writing stories that take anywhere from, 5 minutes to 15 minutes at most. There's no limit, but we anticipate that if this is an educational environment, that most people's attention span, even in virtual reality, will probably be a lesson around an SDG that lasts about that long.
Ray is suffering so much that when a voice in the cornfield tells him to mow down his crop to build a baseball field, he does it. Ease his pain, the voice says. Go the distance. And Ray does it, right? He harvests his crop now, his only source of income, his livelihood, to build his field of dreams. You know what I believe? I believe we all have.
So what you're watching there, why don't you pause it for a second, Zach? So what you're seeing here is, well, let me put it this way. What you're listening to is Charlie, who is the one who wrote this story. And he wrote all the chapters of this story. In this case, he's talking about financial advisory. He's a financial advisor, so his story is about that topic. But you can see he's using analogies like baseball and other things in his story. So we took that audio file and we mapped to the audio file these visuals that you see to bring to life quotes and things that he says in his story. And that's basically what you're watching. Now, Charlie, when he wrote the story, he maybe didn't realize or even know that we were going to dress it up this way when we brought it into virtual reality. So we experiment, we try different things and we see what works and what doesn't work. But ultimately you can see the story really is brought to life in ways you just can't do with other medium. That's what you can do in VR. So now if you take a sustainable development goal, quality education, no hunger, zero poverty, life below water, you build your story and you tell that narrative, you bring the audio file into here, you put it into those bite-sized chunks, you pre-plan it like we showed in the PowerPoint document, and ultimately you come up with this final product that you start to produce. And now you can start seeing the pieces of the puzzle all come together. And that's the purpose of this information session, is just to make you feel like, I get it, I have a method, I have an approach to my thinking where I have a way to design and execute this. Is there, Zach, is there anything else you'd like to share in this piece?
Yeah, I have about another 2 minutes worth of stuff I can share if you'd like.
Sure.
Sometimes we go off the path, right? We think we have to wait on our dreams, right? Come on, till the kids are out of the house, right? Or they're out of college, or then they move back into the house after college, and they say they're only going to stay for a little while, and then they end up staying for 6 months, and then they start asking for money, right? And, no, David, I'm not giving you an allowance. You're 40. Or until a better job comes along, right? Don't we all have this fear that we won't have enough? From the average Joe living paycheck to paycheck to the business tycoon who's got to settle for a Bentley instead of a Rolls. Everyone. If you had that kind of money, wouldn't you just quit your job right? And then you'd go to like Disney, you climb Kilimanjaro, and then you just fall into a pool of gold coins like Scrooge McDuck. But we're all just hardwired to keep bed in an ornate bedroom with a butler tending to him. And the butler,
So this is a different scene that we jump to,
and he does.
a different chapter.
Died and went to heaven, he thinks. So he runs down to the nearest casino where he gambles all night long, winning every hand. He can't lose.
And remember, if you're in virtual, I mean, this is interesting just to watch on a 2D desktop of the virtual reality experience. But if you're in VR, you can be walking,
I can't lose.
you know,
I can't
around
lose.
the story, you know, from any angle you want to see this story. It's almost like movie making in 3D.
I laugh. His suit slowly turns from white to black, and two horns grow.
Adding special effects.
The thug realizes he's in hell, clutches his heart, writhing in pain as he falls to his knees. And I'm going to double this penny.
So here's another chapter.
Word of the other.
I think you get the idea. I mean, this is just pretty brilliant what you can do, right? All around, again, starting with a story, starting with a narrative, something that you and your team actually drafted and wrote out, and then narrated and bring the audio file in here. And everything you see in here, it was one of the information sessions that Zach and Pablo and the team did, where they showed some of the features and functionality, how you get this animation. What, Sam, do you remember which session it was?
It was session 8.
So if you guys go back and look at on our YouTube channel, information session number 8, you'll see some of the features and functionality training for how you create this animation that Zach is showing you. You know, how the team was able to create all these graphics popping up and all these images. And Abby and our team was, you know, she was the one that was building some of the graphic artists and the design that we did that was brought into these environments. So you can see all that on information session 8. And I think even information session, it was 9 where we even went into more technical detail.
Yeah, so it's number 8, but it's just split up into 2. So it's A and B. Okay,
yeah. So you guys have the resources there to see how, you know, Zach and Pablo and Abby and the team were able to create all that animation effect. Not that complicated, definitely doesn't require any program coding. It's just more features and functionality. But, you know, that was the goal here, right? And I don't know, you guys tell me, Pablo and Abby and Zach and Sam, like, it was a lot of fun doing this project too, because it was very creative. I mean, right, we were able to take a client's story and then start mapping it out, right? You guys have any feedback on kind of just that whole experience?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing that I've learned is that when I did the slides, it wasn't the end all be all, but it certainly was the best jumping off point, because I build the slides and I'm gathering assets for it. And then you go in and you start building it and you realize some sections are a little dry. Some sections might be a little bit harder to build than you originally envisioned. And so it's not going to be your like one-to-one copy, but it really does help you get off the diving board and jumping into VR with a plan and with objects that you're ready to start putting in and testing. And then once you have something built in VR, you start to adjust and add and take away from there.
And maybe Abby, do you want to talk a little bit about, you know, we had conversations where you could easily over-engineer this, right? You could have too much going on. Every single sentence could have some visual, and that gets to be over-stimulus. Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, so I think that one of the most important things with bringing something into VR is understanding that anything is possible when you're doing it. You can avoid the limitations that real life has on objects. So if you're looking for objects online and anything like that, anything can be found for either free or a very low price. I think when you're brainstorming, it's important to not focus on what would or wouldn't be possible in VR. It's important to focus on the wow factors of bringing things in that are important for the narrative, rather than focusing on, oh, okay, do you think we can even do that? I think that's a secondary question to trying to come up with the ideas first, and then narrowing that down afterwards once you have a bigger, broader idea sense of different things that you could do, narrowing it down by doing a simple search of whatever you want to find and adding 3D model at the end. It'll add hundreds of options for you to choose from that you can just bring right into VR.
Yeah, one of the things we realized, I know when we did a review, so as a team, the way we did this is, Zach and Pablo and Abby would take the story, break it down, and then Sam and I and all of us would get together and we'd actually review in VR how it was all coming to life. And I remember some of the feedback was like, there's too much happening. It's like, it's too overwhelming. Like you don't need, you could over engineer this very easily. You don't have to have every single sentence or every single word having a visual, right? You only want to use the visuals in the animation for where it makes an extra point. It actually, it takes something that maybe isn't that interesting to listen to and make it more interesting because now you can see it and the picture's worth 1,000 words. However, you don't want to have a picture for each of every 1,000 words, right? You don't want to be doing it across every single statement made because then, we can just tell you from experience, when you're in that environment, it's like there's just too much going on every single, and then it's like, well, why did you animate that around the words, a very simple statement that was made? You could have probably left that out. So just, keep that in mind that as you build these spaces and you bring your story to life, that you also keep a balance between compelling and wow factor, but not overstimulation and over engineering to where the users just feel like they're getting bombarded with, animation around everything. That's not necessarily a good thing. You can easily overdo it, right?
Yeah.
I
The
think
line
that-
that I try and stay on, I always ask myself is, does animating this piece help push the narrative ahead? Is it help the punchline of the joke? Does it help the main theme of this section? Does it help get across the most important facts that I'm trying to outline? And then also make sure that, like, if it is just me, this entire section is just talking about a bunch of educational facts, what are the most important ones? Let's animate those. I don't need to have a 10-second section where every single second I have something happening just to explain some facts that are being told.
I think that a big part of wow factor is understanding which parts of things are a wow in themselves in the narrative. So like if you think about reading a novel or something like that, someone will use beautiful imagery in only words in certain parts of the phrases. They don't need to overanalyze talking about a dog or something like that. If they're trying to make a point on something that they're saying, so if you're trying to make a point on a certain part of the SDG, you want to emphasize that part of that thing you're talking about with an animation, sort of focalize what someone is paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, less can easily be more in many cases. You can make a brilliant environment and tell a brilliant story and actually have very little animation and stimulus, but you should experiment. And this is the fun part you can do with your team is go through this exercise as a group. So anyone else from the team have any other final comments or suggestions or anything to share?
Yeah, so I would just say that, the process of, having a foundation and really mapping everything out overall has helped us as a team really, work fluidly because we're on the same page. We all know what's going where. We all have, like the same idea of what we choose to animate versus what we don't want to animate. And, like we're all working as one mind. So overall, I think that even though we took like a week or two to really sit down and plan it all, I think it saved us a lot more time in the long run in just, small conversations and, really fine-tuning small details that ultimately a plan would have solved for us.
Yeah, and as the way this methodology ends is there's the feedback, evaluation, and don't be afraid to fail. It's if you tell a story and you get into the environment, you start creating. Imagine that over the course of several weeks, as you get feedback from friends and family or within your own team, you're going to iterate. You're going to realize, well, that didn't really work that well. Let's do something different. And because you're dealing with digital real estate, there's no price for failure. So it's okay. That's actually part of the learning process. So that's the whole methodology. We're hoping that, this discussion, the purpose again of this discussion was just to get many of you out there that are still, you got your team organized, you've selected your SDG, you're excited about it, but maybe you're just not getting traction on how to bring your ideas to life. And we thought this is something all of you can do. Everyone, we've been in groups now with some of you out there in the community there, as we've talked to you about, where you are in your process. And then when we've asked the question to the group, like, hey, how many of you know how to tell a story? Usually everybody raises their hand like, yeah, I can tell a story. All right, well, start with that. Tell a story, Danny the dolphin or whomever, just figure some narrative, make it interesting, like writing a novel, and work with people on your team. And if you can, again, the thing that I like about this approach is if you can just get a written story that you guys like, you're onto something, because to bring the visuals in is just going to make it fantastic. I mean, the thing that we did for Charlie there, he already had a successful story that he was using for other purposes that people really liked, but he was just showing PowerPoint slides against the story. That's all he was doing, because that's all he could do. So we already knew but he already knew he was onto something, because people really liked that whole story he was telling. So bringing in a VR, we just knew we had all these superpowers to take it from good to great, right? That was the goal. So hopefully that's helpful to everybody as a method, and you can use this information to get started. The last thing I'll say is, don't be freaked out by thinking it's so complicated technically to bring it all together like Zach showed you. Again, information session number 8, A and B on the YouTube channel. Zach and team actually go into the editor to show you some of the functionality in one of the platforms, how to do that stuff, how to take the audio files and split them up, and how to take the animation and map it to it. It's a little more complex. It's kind of like getting into advanced capabilities in a software like PowerPoint, for example, but that's about as complicated as it'll get. I'm sure many of you who've mastered social media and editing and posting TikTok videos, and it's probably, you're going to be a pro at it right off the bat, because it's really that type of skill set of bringing all that editing together. And, most importantly, if you learn this skill set, hopefully you can all see this is a skill set that makes you relevant to what we feel is a new job market. Because just like this one client we have who's an early adopter, who's using it around their story for financial services, you can imagine every brand, every company, every product, every organization is going to want to tell stories around their product or service, whether it's an educational nonprofit or whether it's a commercial business. This is really the future of how the metaverse will be used. This is where we think it's going to head. And then when you throw in elements like Pablo shared around gamification and trying to get audience to participate, you're really onto a whole nother level of entertainment and art form that we think is going to be highly effective, not just for the work we do at Exponential Destiny, bring it to schools and low-income communities, but for whatever you do. And again, the goal of this competition for us, working with the UN's ITU agency, is to try to expose you to this training so you can start to build this skill set, so you see this opportunity for jobs. Zach, Pablo, Abby, and Samantha now have the skill sets after doing this approach. They could easily go talk to other businesses out there, and other businesses will be highly receptive to exploring this path to do something similar like we've done here, so that they're ready for this metaverse as it takes off in the next several years. So thanks, team, for participating, and to all of you out there working on the competition. Hopefully you found this helpful, and we look forward to seeing what you create. Thank you.